The message came through at 3:47 hours, scrambled and half-drowned in static, but the words were clear enough to freeze every operator in the Tactical Operations Center. This is Viper 2-1, Grid November Zulu 4782, taking effective fire from 3 positions, 1 KIA, 2 critical, cannot hold past sunrise. Then nothing. Just the hiss of dead air and the soft glow of monitors reflecting off worried faces. The forward operating base had lost contact with the reconnaissance team 6 hours earlier, deep in the Korangal Valley, where the mountains swallowed radio waves and good intentions alike. Battalion Command had already written the mission brief for the Quick Reaction Force, already started the casualty notification paperwork, already begun calculating acceptable losses. But they hadn't counted on Captain Isla Torrance. She stood in the operations tent with her flight suit still smelling of JP-8 fuel and rotor wash, her call sign, Widow, stitched in faded thread above her left breast pocket. At 34, she'd flown more combat hours in the A-64 Apache than most pilots logged in their entire careers, but the younger guys still snickered when she walked past, still made their jokes about whether she could handle the aircraft's weight or its weapon systems. She'd stopped correcting them 2 deployments ago. Results spoke louder than arguing ever could. The tactical operations officer was a major with precisely 2 weeks in country, still learning which ridgelines had names and which ones just had body counts. He studied the map with the concentrated intensity of someone who'd learned geography from PowerPoint presentations rather than blood. The valley's socked in until 800, Captain. Cloud ceilings at 200 feet, visibility less than a quarter mile. We'll send the QRF at first light. His tone carried the finality of someone accustomed to being obeyed, the certainty of someone who'd never had to choose between bad options and worse ones. Isla didn't raise her voice. She never did. Those men don't have until first light, sir. The message said they can't hold past sunrise. That's 43 minutes from now. She traced the contour lines with her finger, calculating approach vectors and break points, mentally cataloging every draw and defilade she'd memorized during 3 previous rotations through this particular slice of hell. The major opened his mouth to respond, probably to explain whether minimums and risk assessment matrices and all the other careful reasons why regulations existed. But Isla was already walking toward the flight line, already pulling her helmet bag from the rack, already running through her pre-flight checklist in her mind. Behind her, she heard the major's voice rising in protest, heard the operations sergeant making a phone call, heard the whole careful machinery of military bureaucracy beginning to grind into motion. She didn't stop walking. The Apache sat on the tarmac like a predatory insect, all angles and weapons pylons and the promise of controlled violence. Her crew chief, Sergeant Marcus Webb, was already there, working through the pre-flight inspection with a flashlight clenched in his teeth. He didn't ask questions when she appeared in the darkness. They'd flown together long enough that words were optional, understanding was assumed. He just nodded once and kept working, checking the chain gun's feed mechanism while she climbed into the front seat of the tandem cockpit. The instruments glowed to life as she powered up systems, familiar as her own heartbeat, comforting in their mechanical certainty. Widow, this is Tower. You are not cleared for takeoff. Repeat, not cleared for takeoff. The radio transmission carried official weight, the kind that ended careers and started court-martials. Isla adjusted her night vision monocle and began her engine start sequence, feeling the aircraft shudder and wake beneath her hands. Tower, Widow, declaring emergency authority under code 77 Charlie, wounded in contact, immediate departure required. It was a real regulation, buried somewhere in the Emergency Procedures Manual, the kind that gave commanders legal cover if things went right and scapegoats if they didn't. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. The rotors were already beginning to turn, the turbines building to their distinctive whine. The Apache lifted off into darkness so complete it felt like rising into deep water, the ground falling away invisible beneath her. Through the FLIR she could see the thermal signature of the base shrinking behind her, could see the heat bloom of confused personnel scrambling in her wake. Then she turned north, toward the mountains, toward the clouds, toward men who were counting seconds until sunrise and praying someone would prove regulations wrong. The weather was exactly as bad as advertised. At 1,500 feet, she hit the cloud deck, and the world disappeared into gray nothing. Only her instruments and training standing between controlled flight and a smear of wreckage across some nameless Afghan ridgeline. She descended into the soup, watching her radar altimeter count down the shrinking distance to terrain she couldn't see, trusting the mental map she'd built from dozens of previous missions. The regulations said minimum safe altitude in instrument conditions was 500 feet above ground level in mountainous terrain. She watched the altimeter tick through 400, then 300, then 250. The clouds didn't break. The GPS showed her position creeping north through the valley, showed the elevation of the surrounding peaks rising on either side like jaws closing. At 150 feet, she was still flying blind, the Apache shuddering through turbulence while condensation streaked across the canopy. Any sane person would have climbed back to safety, would have waited for the weather to lift, would have trusted the Major's careful calculations about acceptable risk. Isla pushed the stick forward and descended to 100 feet. The world remained gray, remained empty of everything except the scream of turbines and the steady pulse of her own breathing inside the helmet. She thought about the team on the ground, thought about the message that had stopped transmitting, thought about all the other times someone had decided that safety mattered more than lives. At 80 feet above the valley floor, flying through clouds in terrain that rose to 8,000 feet on either side, she was committed. There was no turning back, no climbing to safety, no second chances if her navigation was off by even a few dozen yards. Then at 40 feet the clouds broke. It happened all at once, the gray dissolving into sudden clarity, the valley floor visible through the FLIR in shades of green and black, the river a dark snake winding between rock walls that rose like cathedral buttresses into the overcast above. She had maybe 200 yards of visibility forward, maybe 300 feet of clearance above ground. It was barely enough. She transitioned to nap-of-earth flight, the Apache screaming up the valley at 120 knots with the wheels almost brushing the scrub pine, following the terrain with predatory precision. Through the targeting system, she could see the heat signatures of scattered compounds, of animals stirring at the sound of her approach, of the land itself radiating the memory of yesterday's sun. The grid coordinates from the original message resolved into a shallow bowl in the ridgeline, 3 mud-walled compounds forming a rough triangle around what might have been a village square or might have been a killing ground. Her targeting systems painted the scene in clinical detail. 7 heat signatures clustered behind a low wall, 3 more scattered and motionless, muzzle flashes sparking from 2 of the compounds in controlled bursts. She could see it all with mechanical clarity, could see the tactical geometry of the ambush, could see how the reconnaissance team had been pinned in the open with nowhere to go and nobody coming to help. Until now. Viper 2-1, this is Widow inbound from the south, authenticate Papa Whiskey 7-9er. She kept her voice level professional, giving them the code that meant friendly forces were entering the battle space. For 3 seconds there was nothing, just the sound of her own breathing and the Apache's systems humming their electronic songs. Then a voice came back, rough with exhaustion and something that might have been disbelief. Widow, Viper 2-1, authenticate confirmed. We have 3 urgent surgical ammunition critical. How copy? The relief in those words was palpable even through the distortion of combat radios and bad encryption. Viper 2-1, good copy, maintain cover and mark your position, 30 seconds. She armed the weapons systems, feeling the Apache transform from machine to instrument, from vehicle to extension of her will. The 30 chain gun tracked with her helmet movements, the Hydra rockets waited in their pods, the Hellfire missiles hummed ready on their rails. She'd never liked the killing part, had never developed the taste for it that some pilots seemed to cultivate. But she'd learned to be very, very good at it, had learned that precision and speed saved more lives than hesitation ever could. Through the targeting system, she watched an infrared strobe begin to pulse from behind the wall where the team had taken cover, watched the enemy positions continue their measured fire, watched the whole tactical picture resolve into simple geometry and firing solutions. She came in from the south with the sun still hidden behind the mountains, the Apache's profile invisible against the dark ridgeline, the sound of her rotors swallowed by the valley's acoustics until she was almost on top of them. The first compound erupted in a storm of 30 fire, the chain gun cycling at 625 rounds per minute, each explosive round finding its mark with mechanical certainty. She could see figures scattering through the FLIR, could see the heat bloom of secondary explosions as ammunition cooked off, could see the careful ambush dissolving into chaos as she rolled the Apache left and brought the second compound into her sights. This time she used rockets, 6 of them in a ripple that turned the mud walls into dust and the firing positions into craters. The third compound tried to run, tried to break contact and fade into the network of wadis and draws that made this valley a maze. She tracked them with the targeting system, watched them sprint between cover, watched them realize too late that there was nowhere to hide from an Apache with thermal sights and a pilot who knew every fold in this terrain. Viper 2-1 Widow, positions neutralized, preparing to cover your extraction. How copy? She circled the bowl in a tight orbit, scanning for additional threats, watching her fuel gauge and calculating the math of how long she could maintain station before she'd need to break for the base. The response came back stronger now, the voice carrying something beyond relief, something closer to awe. Widow, solid copy, we're moving to primary LZ, 5 minutes. How the hell did you get through that weather? She didn't answer, just kept scanning, kept watching, kept the Apache between the team and any possible threat. The extraction bird would be coming soon, would be lifting off from the base now that the weather was starting to clear, now that someone else had proven it could be done. She held position while the US-60 Black Hawk came thundering up the valley, held position, while the team loaded their wounded and their dead, held position, until the extraction bird was clear and climbing for altitude. Only then did she turn south, back toward the base, back toward the major who would want explanations and the commander who would want to discuss regulations, and the whole weight of military bureaucracy that measured heroism against liability. The clouds had lifted now, the valley opening to morning light, the mountains showing their peaks against a sky that was shifting from black to gray to the pale blue of early dawn. She flew through it all with the Apache systems powering down from combat ready to cruise, with her hands steady on the controls, with her heart rate finally beginning to slow from the sharp focus of contact to something approaching normal. The base appeared ahead, the familiar pattern of its perimeter and structures, the flight line with its rows of helicopters, and the operations tent where people would already be forming opinions and preparing questions. She brought the Apache in smooth, touching down light despite the aircraft's weight, feeling the skids settle onto concrete with barely a shudder. The engine whine began to fade, the rotors slowing their rotation, the whole deadly machine returning to stillness. She went through her shutdown checklist with the same precision she brought to everything, each switch and control positioned exactly right, everything secured and safe. Only then did she climb down, her legs slightly unsteady after 2 hours in the seat, her flight suit dark with sweat despite the cold. The major was waiting, his face showing that peculiar mix of anger and uncertainty that came from being proven wrong in ways that might be right. Behind him stood the battalion commander, a full colonel who'd spent his career learning when to enforce regulations and when to pretend he hadn't seen them broken. Isla walked toward them, helmet bag in hand, already knowing how this conversation would go, already preparing her after-action report in her mind. But before the major could speak, before the colonel could begin whatever careful speech he'd prepared, a Humvee pulled up and a soldier jumped out, a sergeant with his arm in a sling and his face showing the peculiar gray of recent blood loss. He walked straight to Isla, ignoring rank and protocol, and the gathering crowd of pilots and mechanics who'd come to see what happened next. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Dalton, Viper 21 team leader." His voice carried the flatness of exhaustion and something else, something deeper. "My medic said we had maybe 10 minutes before Corporal Williams bled out, maybe 20 before the position was overrun." He paused, his good hand clenching and unclenching at his side. "I don't know how you flew through that weather. I don't know how you found us in the dark. But I know my team is alive because you decided regulations mattered less than we did." He didn't salute, didn't step back, just held her eyes with his own. "Thank you, ma'am. That's all, just thank you." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Isla standing in the growing light with the Major's prepared speech dying on his lips, and the Colonel's careful expression shifting into something that might have been respect. The operations tent was warmer now, filled with the morning shift and the smell of bad coffee and the low murmur of radio traffic. Isla sat across from the Colonel while he read through her preliminary report, watching his face for the tells that would indicate which way this would fall. He set the papers down carefully, aligned them with the edge of the desk, bought himself a few seconds of thinking time. "Captain Torrance, you violated weather minimums, departed without clearance, and flew a combat mission in conditions that grounded every other aircraft on this base." His voice was level, judicial, the tone of someone reading charges. Then he leaned back in his chair, and some of the formality drained away. "You also saved 7 lives and recovered 3 KIA who would otherwise be on a mountainside indefinitely. That's the report I'm sending up the chain." He pulled out a second folder, this one thinner, the paper inside official enough that Isla could see the seal even from across the desk. "Effective immediately, you're the senior Apache pilot for all weather operations. When the conditions are bad and the mission is critical, you're the one who decides if it flies." He slid the orders across to her, watched her process what that meant. It wasn't a medal, wasn't a promotion, wasn't anything that would show on her record beyond a simple line in her duties assignment. But it was trust, the kind that came from commanders who'd learned to read people instead of just regulations. "The Major is being reassigned to a staff position. No formal reprimand, but he won't be making tactical decisions anymore. Do you have any questions, Captain?" Isla thought about all the things she could say, all the explanations she could offer, all the justifications she'd prepared on the flight back. In the end, she just shook her head. "No, sir. No questions." She stood, took the orders, walked back out into the morning light that was spreading across the flight line like a promise. The Apache sat where she'd left it, Sergeant Webb already working through the post-flight inspection, already preparing the bird for whatever came next. He looked up as she approached, reading something in her expression. "We good, ma'am," she nodded once, setting her helmet bag down on the tarmac. "We're good, Sergeant. Let's get her ready. Something tells me this weather isn't finished with us yet." The nickname spread through the base like smoke, quiet and persistent and impossible to stop. They stopped calling her widow, stopped using the call sign she'd earned 3 years earlier when her aircraft had been the only one to return from a mission that went sideways in the Helmand province. Now they called her 40 feet, sometimes just 40, a reference to the altitude where she'd broken clouds when everyone else said it couldn't be done. She heard it in the chow line, heard it in the operations briefings, heard it in the respectful nods from crew chiefs and the careful distance from pilots who were still trying to decide if she was brave or crazy. She didn't correct them. The name would either stick or it wouldn't, and nothing she said would change that arithmetic. The missions kept coming, each one blending into the next in the way combat deployments had of turning time into a strange slurry of intense focus punctuated by endless waiting. But the bad weather calls always went to her now. The missions where the clouds hung low and the visibility dropped to nothing, and some ground commander needed fire support regardless of what the meteorology officer said was possible. She flew them all, sometimes alone, sometimes with a wingman brave enough or foolish enough to follow her into weather that violated every regulation in the book. She brought them all back, every single time, the Apache settling onto the tarmac with its weapons expended, and its fuel gauge reading close to fumes, but its crew intact and its mission complete. 3 weeks after the Korangal Valley rescue, she got a different kind of call. The Tactical Operations Center patched her through to a frequency she didn't recognize, a voice with the flat accent of somewhere in the American Midwest. "Widow, this is Ranger 6 Actual. We have a sensitive situation developing. Need to discuss offline. How copy?" She copied, gave them a time and a frequency, and an hour later found herself in a classified briefing with two officers she'd never met and a mission brief that made the weather violation look like a parking ticket. High-value target, limited window, zero tolerance for failure. The kind of mission that ended careers if it went wrong and disappeared into classified files if it went right. The target was a compound in the Shahikot Valley. Intelligence indicated a Taliban commander who'd been coordinating attacks across 3 provinces. The surveillance had been ongoing for weeks, the pattern of life analysis showing a small window between 400 and 430 when the compound security was at its minimum. There would be a special operations team inserted by helicopter, fast rope entry, hard target interdiction. They needed an Apache overhead for fire support, needed someone who could navigate the valley approaches in darkness, needed a pilot who wouldn't flinch if the mission went loud. The briefing officer, a major with the quiet competence of someone who'd done this many times before, studied her across the map table. "You come highly recommended, Captain, but I need to know you can follow the rules of engagement. This isn't a troops in contact situation. This is surgical. No civilian casualties, no collateral damage, no mistakes." Isla met his eyes and didn't blink. "Sir, I can put a rocket through a window at 2,000 meters in zero visibility conditions. Surgical is what I do." The major nodded slowly, made some decision behind his eyes. "You're scheduled for 3:45 departure tomorrow. Flight plan is in the system. Any questions?" She had dozens, but she'd learned long ago that some questions didn't get answered until you were airborne and committed. "No, sir. I'll be ready." She spent the rest of the day studying the approach, memorizing every ridgeline and draw, building the mental map that would keep her alive when the instruments failed or the mission went sideways. Sergeant Webb worked on the Apache with the methodical intensity of someone who knew that attention to detail meant the difference between coming home and becoming a memorial. The insertion went smooth, the special operations team roping down into the compound with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this enough times to make it look easy. Isla held position 2,000 meters out, the Apache invisible in the darkness, watching through the FLIR as the team moved through the compound room by room. Then the radio crackled and the mission changed character in the space of 3 words. "Widow, Ranger 6, compromised, immediate fire support, West Wall, how copy?" She didn't hesitate, didn't wait for the major to approve the change in posture, just brought the targeting system around and found the heat signatures of fighters running toward the compound's western perimeter. The chain gun spoke once, a 3-second burst that erased the threat with clinical precision. Then again, eliminating a position on the roof. Then the hellfire, tracking toward a vehicle that was approaching fast from the north. The mission lasted 7 minutes from compromise to exfiltration. 7 minutes where she cycled through every weapons system the Apache carried. 7 minutes where her world narrowed to the targeting reticle and the radio calls, and the mechanical certainty of making the right decisions faster than the enemy could react. When the Special Operations team lifted off in their Black Hawk, when they were clear and climbing for altitude, only then did she exhale fully, only then did she realize her hands were aching from gripping the controls. The major's voice came through on the command frequency, professionally neutral. "Widow, Ranger 6 Actual, good effects, target secured, RTB when able." That was it. No congratulations, no assessment, just the acknowledgement that the mission was complete, and she was released to return to base. The after-action briefing happened in a windowless room with people whose names she wasn't given, and whose units she wasn't told. They showed her the intelligence recovered from the compound, showed her the connections that had been disrupted, showed her the attacks that wouldn't happen because of 7 minutes of precise violence in a valley most people couldn't find on a map. Then they thanked her with the brisk efficiency of people who had other missions to plan, other targets to track, other pilots to brief. She walked out into the afternoon sun, feeling the peculiar hollowness that came after combat, the sense that something significant had occurred, but that its significance would always remain classified, would always be measured in negative space, in the things that didn't happen because she'd been there. That night in the pilot's lounge, a captain she barely knew bought her a bottle of near beer from the base exchange and raised it in a toast. "To 40 feet," he said, and the other pilots echoed it, and for the first time since she'd arrived in-country, Isla felt like she might be part of something beyond just her and her aircraft and the missions that kept coming. She didn't say anything, just nodded her thanks and drank her near beer and listened to the stories they told about other missions, other pilots, other times when someone had done something impossible and made it look routine. The war would continue, the missions would keep coming, the mountains would remain indifferent to all of it. But for one night, in a plywood lounge on a forward operating base 8,000 miles from home, she was just another pilot swapping stories and watching the stars through a window screen while the generators hummed and the guard towers maintained their vigil against the darkness beyond the wire. The deployment ended the way they all did, with a manifest and a ceremony and the strange compression of experience that came from transitioning back to a world where people worried about traffic and weather forecasts and problems that didn't involve calculating weapon solutions in zero visibility. Isla rotated back to Fort Bragg, back to a training squadron and a desk, and the odd displacement of being somewhere that wasn't actively trying to kill her. The Apache felt different in stateside airspace, felt tame somehow, like a predator in a zoo going through the motions of being dangerous. She flew the training missions and signed the evaluation forms and sat through the briefings about budget constraints and readiness metrics, all while some part of her mind remained in those Afghan valleys, calculating approach vectors and break points against terrain she could no longer see. 6 months after her return, she got a call from a number she didn't recognize, a voice that introduced itself as belonging to the Command Chief Warrant Officer of Army Aviation. "Captain Torrance, we're assembling a working group to revise the Weather Operations Manual for attack aviation. Your name came up more than once as someone with relevant experience." Relevant experience. That was one way to describe flying through conditions that should have killed her, making decisions that should have ended her career, bringing people home who wouldn't have made it otherwise. She accepted the assignment, spent 3 months working with meteorologists and test pilots and risk management officers, translating her instincts and experience into procedures that could be taught, that could be standardized, that could make the next generation of pilots slightly more likely to survive the impossible missions. The manual they produced was boring, technical, filled with charts and minimums and decision matrices. But buried in its appendices were the techniques she'd developed, the approaches she'd refined, the hard-won knowledge of how to read terrain through clouds and navigate by dead reckoning when the instruments conflicted and the maps were wrong. She wondered sometimes if anyone would use it, if anyone would find themselves in the situations where this knowledge mattered. Then she'd remember Sergeant Dalton and his wounded team, remember the special operations missions, remember all the times when the difference between living and dying had come down to someone willing to fly when everyone else said it couldn't be done.